Okay. Today is November 5th, 2004. We're interviewing Steve Whelan. Can you start off by saying your name and spelling it for us?
Stephen Whelan, Steven Whelan.
And just a brief biographical sketch here. When were you born and where?
I was born in March 1950 in Buffalo, New York, raised, went to school there, and did 1 year in St. Bonaventure University where I promptly flunked out and joined the Navy in 1969. Was stationed in Corpus Christi, Texas and Rota, Spain. And it was in Rota, Spain that I had my first affiliation with Embry-Riddle in about 1975.
And that's exactly what my next question was going to be. What was your first position at Embry-Riddle, and how did you hear about us? And
well, Embry-Riddle had just opened in 1975 in Rota, Spain. It was the whole Iberian program was started by a man named Bill Dickinson. And the registrar is what they were called at the time, which should be now a center director. At the time they were referred to as registrars, was a woman named Deirdre Fallon. I had been on flight status for 2 years in the Navy and it was my own personal decision that I didn't know which way my life was going, and I wanted to go back to school when I got out of the Navy. And continue studying in university, and saw Embry-Riddle there, and I wanted to get an A&P license, and one of the programs they offered was the AMT program.
okay.
So I went in there and started taking AMT classes.
And how long did it take you to graduate with that license, or was it a diploma at the time?
No, what they had a certificate program, I think it was, for the AMT. You completed in those days. It was 9 courses. For AMT, and this was for the extended campus, as it would have been at the time. And I went through most of the AMT courses there, and I did complete my AMP license. Bill Dickinson was eventually appointed by the FAA as a designated mechanic examiner, a DME, and he probably gave, my guess is, 20 or 30 mechanic licenses in Rota prior to his departure, which would have been in 1978. Maybe not that many, you could check with him. But he was a DMA. We built up a real nice maintenance laboratory. We went to various Spanish junkyards and collected all kinds of parts. We found a wrecked Beech 18 in Sevilla Airport. We got an engine and a lot of the system components off of it.
Oh, wow.
The Navy had a huge scrapyard in Rota, Spain, so Bill was down there every day finding anything he could, and we built up a shop that was good enough that the FAA, deemed it eligible to give A&P exams.
Wow.
So, and they would come down about twice a year from Frankfurt and administer themselves the A&P written exam. At that time, there were no testing centers. The FAA themselves issued it.
Right.
So I took the exam several times. The first time I took it, I was absolutely not prepared, but what I needed to do is get past the interview and the eligibility certification to where I could take it. So I took it, and then I repeated it until I passed all of it, and then took my A&P license there. I left the Navy and Rota, Spain in May of 1978, and by that time I had both my A&P license.
All right, okay. Did you take any other courses or degrees, or just that one?
Not then. While I was in the Navy and Rota, Spain, I just did the AMT program and got my A&P license because I wanted a mechanic license, and I also wanted to continue with Riddle and eventually get a bachelor degree. And what happened is it was getting close to the end of 1977, early 78. The dean at the time, whose name was Bob Coleman, came down and I met him, and we started talking one time, and they said, gee, would you like to teach for us up in Germany? Because I was getting out of the Navy, I didn't know what I wanted to do.
Right.
In 78, I had a Volkswagen camping bus, and I wanted to spend a year just bumming around Europe. And he said, why don't you come up and teach for us in Germany? So I accepted the job. He said, no, first, I received my discharge in May of 78. I flew up to Frankfurt. There was one of the, wasn't a faculty, he was one of the staff. He ran the AMT program at the time. His name was Doug Burcham. Picked me up at the airport and took me over to Wiesbaden. We met Bob Coleman and his replacement, as Bob Coleman was leaving Embry-Riddle, his replacement was Russ Lewis. Russ Lewis had been the head of the flight department at Embry-Riddle, and he came over to take the European campus over.
Oh, wow, okay.
So they interviewed me, talked to me, and it was pretty informal, and they said, sure, why don't you spend a day or two here with Doug Burcham. He'll show you a little bit about Riddle, what you're doing, and how it works. And I followed him around for a day or so. We visited a couple of centers in Germany. We went to Heidelberg, I remember, and went to a center there and saw some students and how they're doing things and so on. And they said, when can you start? I said, how about, come back before the school season? So we agreed on the date of August 1st. So he dropped me off at Rhein-Main Airport. I flew back to visit my parents for a couple months, came back and spent the whole month of July traveling around France in my camping bus,
Yeah.
living on the Riviera in a camping bus and thinking about a job I had there. I had a pretty good time. And then showed up at Riddle's doorstep on August 1st, 1978, and that's when I officially started as an employee.
Had you ever taught before in any capacity?
No, none whatsoever.
Were you nervous about suddenly here you were?
Well, I knew I had to. What they did was when I arrived in '78, again, it was very unstructured. They got me a room in the American Arms Hotel, and it just so happened Dr. Frank Vanderwert was teaching a week-long seminar. At that time, Riddle had a program that seemed to be extremely popular with the military students, and they would have one-week seminars. They would bring a professor, sometimes from Daytona Beach, sometimes local European faculty, and they would run an undergraduate 3-credit-hour course on 5 days.
Wow.
So you'd come in Monday, and by the time you hit Friday afternoon, you were done with the course. It was a pressure cooker. As an undergraduate, I took a number of those courses, and they were tough. You were sitting there, they had to lecture, you had projects you had to do, so you were busy night and day, but it was workable, and they would have them twice a year. They had the winter seminars. It was right after Christmas, after people came back from Christmas vacation in the first week of January, and then they had the summer seminars that were in the summer. And so it was the two low spots of the year in terms of workload for the militaries, and we would get 30, 35 students at a time. Would come in from all over Europe. They would come from Sigonella, Rhoda, all over Germany, and to take these week-long seminars, because they could knock out 3-credit hours.
3-credit hours, 5 days of just...
You could do, they would run 2 at a time, and you could actually at that time knock out 6-credit hours in 2 weeks.
That's incredible.
It was a pressure cooker thing to do, and you got the books ahead of time, you had to read it. But we had some great people come in and teach. We had some really good, knowledgeable individuals came through and had good programs.
Remember offhand what they taught or names?
We had a man named Bob Ford who was retired and living in Madrid. And Bob Ford spent close to 35 or 40 years with TWA. He retired as the chief dispatcher from TWA Airlines and had made a number of publications in his life internally to TWA, but relating to airline operations and airport operations. He was sent by TWA as a consultant to work with the Saudi Arabians for the development of Saudi Arabian Airlines. Oh, wow. The man had worked all over the world. During World War II, he ran a transit airport down in Brazil when bombers were transferred down through South America into Brazil, across to Africa, then up into Europe. And he ran the airfield down there and had as many as 200 or 300 airplanes at a time on the airfield for a 1-day or 2-day stopover.
That's incredible.
And he had an interesting career. He passed away about 6 years ago at the age of 85. But he started in aviation in the 1930s, and he was hired by Pan American World Airways in Miami Beach for his qualifications as a lifeguard. And the reason they hired him as a lifeguard, his job was to swim out to the Sikorsky flying boats, attach the beaching wheels on it,
right,
and then they could winch the aircraft up on the ramp so they could be cleaned, washed, and maintained.
What a start to a career.
That was his start in aviation. Then he left Pan Am after a number of years and went to work for TWA and stayed on there eventually became a head dispatcher. He came in and taught airport development and operations. Very, very good course.
Okay, to jump back here a bit in time, you mentioned the place in Spain where you were building up the AMT program and getting the different plane parts and bringing them back.
It was at Rota, Spain, yeah.
Rota, Spain. What, do you recall, like, what was the building like? What was the facility like when you first arrived? What kind
we had two things. When I was a student there in the 1970s, the Navy had given us an office building on the flight line next to one of the squadron's VQ2. It was there was a little industrial complex over there.
Right.
They had what was called the Aircraft Intermediate Maintenance Department, AIMD, and that's where they overhauled the components that came off of the aircraft. It was a next level of maintenance, so to speak. So they would overhaul generators, starters, break down engines and so on. There was an empty, small office building, one-story square, typical
Yeah.
nondescript government building with a couple of windows and doors in it.
Yeah.
And one side was an office, and the other side was an AMT lab.
So that's where you had.
And we had a double door, so we actually went to the junkyard. At that time, shortly before that, VQ2 had operated C-121, ECM 121Q Super Constellations, which had reciprocating engines on them.
Yeah, yeah.
And in about 1975, late 74, early 75, they scrapped the last one. So Bill Dickinson went down to the junkyard and he found a movable engine stand,
Wow.
a maintenance stand for with the engine. You could attach the engine mount to it, and this thing would rotate and tilt so you could work on it. It was a workbench for assembling these large radial
That's not
engines.
cheap. these
No, but the
days.
Navy was scrapping it. Yeah, they had no use for that. The 3350s were gone.
Jeez.
But we had found this Beech 18 engine, an R985, and brought it back. So Bill got the stand. A number of students cleaned it up. We took it apart, greased it, oiled it, painted it, and went over to AIMD because we had students in AIMD, and they had welding shops, machine shops. So we made adapters to adapt this 985 to the engine, and it stayed there.
Wow. And okay, so that was Spain. What were the facilities like in Germany that you mentioned when you first started teaching? You said 78.
Yeah, I started. What happened when I came here on August 1st, 1978? They assigned me to a regional director named Lee Hoffaker. Lee Hoffaker was based in Mannheim, and he was responsible for Ramstein, Zweibrücken, Pirmasens, I believe Heidelberg, and a few other areas. And I was assigned to teach my first term in Ramstein and Zweibrücken. There, but Lee also had a number of projects on the side. He owned a Beech 18 that he rented out to a flying club at Coleman Barracks, and this airplane was used for dropping parachute jumpers from the Coleman Army, from the Illesheim Army Airfield Parachute Club.
Right.
So I would go down on weekends and work with him at the time. And what happened was we were building up a maintenance lab, and at that time the U.S. Air Force gave Riddle about 9 or 10 Piper PA-135s. They would have been, military designation was an L-21.
Okay.
And these were Piper Cubs, Super Cubs, 135 horsepower Super Cubs that were returned from the Italian Army back to the U.S. Air Force.
Oh,
They were built in the 1950s,
Yeah.
and Riddle got about 15 of them. And they spread those all over the Riddle network throughout Europe
Right.
to be used in the AMT labs as training devices. So Lee Hoffaker, Bob Blakesley, and myself worked one weekend. We cut the hand railing off of a lab down in Capone.
Yeah.
We disassembled the airplane. We literally carried it up into the building
Gee,
and
part by
reassembled it. And again, Lee Hoffaker was a guy that was very industrious, and he hounded around military and civilian junkyards and found a lot of airplane parts and so on.
Yeah.
Eventually, we built up quite a large laboratory in Capone by Ramstein. What was interesting was a few years later, the Air Force came in and divided the building because it was one large room upstairs. They put walls and offices in there to the point that it was impossible to get the airplane out of the building.
So this thing was stuck in there permanently.
This was permanently stuck in
I
there.
wonder if it's still there.
No, it's gone. I don't know. I think they cut it up and scrapped it, or somebody they said to get rid of it, and so it disappeared somehow.
Man. Okay. In a larger sense, do you recall how the EC was set up organizationally? Like you had the European sort of conglomerate as a whole. How was it set up?
Okay, what we had
By
at the time.
country or
No, we had a central headquarters in Wiesbaden. We had a dean, an assistant dean, a dean of graduate studies. We had up to 14, a staff of 14 people in Wiesbaden up to one point. They did all their own academic evaluations, the VA processing, and so on there. And then what they had was they had the regions divided up pretty much by countries. In Germany, you had about 2 or 3 different regional directors. You had one for southern Bavaria. You had one for Rhineland-Pfalz because of the high number of bases in Germany.
right?
You had would have had a regional director. For a while, they would have had regional directors like in Spain. They had a regional director in the UK because there you had Bentwaters, Woodbridge, Lake and Heath, Alconbury, a large number of bases up there. So we had
Wow.
sort of regional managers. It was structured like any company would be.
And how, okay, you started as an employee in '78. When was your last day with us? And
Okay, what happened during my time there, I stayed with Riddle in '78 and was just strictly in a faculty teaching mode. And then I was offered an opportunity in spring of 1980, April 1980, to move to the UK and teach over there. They said, we need you to help with the enrollments and so on, so go over to England and make it work at Bentwaters Woodbridge. So I relocated to Bentwater Woodbridge, and we had a center director there.
what year would that be?
That would have been in 1980.
1980?
79, excuse me, 1979.
Germany, England, okay.
I relocated from Germany to England in 1979 and relocated again from England to Spain in 1980. But
Wow.
during that year, we had one registrar there, a girl named Kathy Catchings. We had about an enrollment of 20 students. And they wanted to build the program up. They wanted to build the AMT program up. I had a World War II Quonset hut, an L-21, one of the Riddle airplanes, plus a number of parts and pieces that I scavenged out of drunk yards that got donated to us, and built up a little AMT lab. I had a good AMT program going. By then we were down to 7 courses in the AMT program. And we also built the program up academically to where by the time I left there was over 100 students per term.
Wow.
At Bentwaters Woodbridge, yeah.
From how many?
20.
20, and you ended
In
with,
1 year with over 100.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
That's what they need now. They need that kind of help. So,
There's not most
Off
of these
the
bases
record.
are closed. The
well, just to go ahead, that I was going to follow up by saying, how has the EC changed over the years? And you've just answered one of them, which
Yeah.
is that you're seeing a lot of the bases have closed. So
yeah, since the downfall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, many bases have closed. American soldiers were quite common throughout Germany. You just don't see them today.
Right.
The ones that are stationed there have all been sent off to Iraq. Most of the bases, when you drive by them, there's a few civilian guards out front, and that's it.
Right. Okay. So where were we then?
I was in the UK, worked there for a year, and then in 1980, spring of 1980, I transferred back to Rota, Spain for Riddle. So I drove in my camping bus all the way from England down to Spain.
So you did a circle, right back
Yeah,
where you
right back to Rota. So in
where you
1980, I got out of the Navy in '78, and 2 years later, I was back in Rota, Spain again. And it was a similar situation there. We had a registrar. We had about 20 enrollments a term, and they wanted to build it up. So I stayed there for 3 years, and I was personally responsible for Rota, Spain, and Sigonella, Sicily. In Rota, over a 3-year period, we eventually built up a good rapport with the ESO. We managed to get over about 100 students per term.
That's incredible. Wow. Okay, so how long were you with us for then?
Well, then what happened, by that time we had a fairly large turnover of deans, and by the time I was in Rota, Spain, Russ Lewis had left, and a new dean came in named Pamela Myers. And Pamela Myers was a very business-oriented woman. She had an MBA, she had a lot of ideas, and she wanted to completely restructure the way the university did business in Europe. So one day she showed up down in Rota, Spain, and she told me, she said, "You're now responsible for Sigonella only," and the girl that was the registrar had responsibility for Rota. So I said, "Okay, that's what you want." And then she didn't stay very long, and then a temporary dean came in named John McCurdy, and he called me up and he said, "Look, you're not doing anything in Spain. Come up here." By that time, I had gotten more into administration, university administration,
Right.
than teaching. I still would teach one course a month, one course a term rather, but I did a lot of administration work, student enrollments and so on like that,
How did
mostly
you feel?
recruiting. Oh, I liked it. What happened too is once I started working as an employee for Embry-Riddle, I found out one of the benefits was you could have, at that time, 2 free undergraduate courses per term and 1 free graduate course.
Right.
Plus, I was a Vietnam era veteran, so I had my GI Bill. So I said, I can't make it any better than this.
Right.
Plus, at that time, I had gone ahead and I applied to the FAA to become an inspection authorization. And I started working with flying clubs and private individuals on my own time on weekends and evenings, inspecting and repairing airplanes, and turned that into a little lucrative side business, so to speak.
Right.
So there was no reason for me to go back to the United States. I had the world in my hands down there.
All right, okay.
And it was a good chance to go to school, and we had a lot of good faculty, a lot of good adjunct faculty came through. So I took a lot of courses with Maryland, which obviously I had to pay for, but I had a GI Bill for that. So from Riddle's standpoint, all the aeronautical science courses I took with them didn't cost me anything, so it was a good benefit.
All right.
So I finished, when I was in Rota, Spain, I finished my bachelor's degree, and then by that point I was called back to the university in Germany to work with them up there and developing some programs and some changes. So in September 1983, I relocated from Rota back to Wiesbaden. I wound up as the AMT coordinator, program coordinator.
Okay.
And what they wanted to do is they wanted to rewrite the book on that. So we basically condensed, I rewrote all the AMT courses for the international campus, making that a 5-course program. So that an individual could take his A&P license based on an experience, and the 5 courses would provide the academic knowledge to balance it off so they could pass the written and oral and practical exams.
So where would that be used, just in Europe or the EC worldwide?
No, as far as I know, it's still in the catalog.
That's great.
The extended campus, the AMT program they uses a course, I think 5 courses. It was general course, there was an electrical course, power plant course, a systems course, and a structures course.
Wow, okay.
As far as I know, I haven't seen a catalog in 15 years, so I don't know what's in it. But I think, from what people have told me, I think it's still the same. But I wrote those 5 programs at the time.
And what year was that, roughly?
That was, I arrived in 83 and I left in 86, so that was probably around 84, 85, something like that.
And 86,
what happened in 86, I finished my MAS degree. I was not a doctorate.
Master of Aeronautical
yeah,
Science?
Master MAS degree.
Too many acronyms.
Yeah, I finished my MAS degree. There was no place for me to go within the Riddle hierarchy, and I wanted to go into industry. I had passed up some job offers in transit, but I wanted to finish up through the master's degree, so I stayed with Riddle, for a total of 8 years. And in 1986, I think it was time to part company, so I started looking for a job. I was hired by Piper Aircraft in Vero Beach as the regional product support manager for Europe, Africa, and Middle East.
So you were able to stay?
Yeah, in fact, they stayed there, but it was a short-lived job. I came back to Vero Beach for a while, for several months training. They had a reorganization and were sold out. And I lost my job, but I wound up getting another job also in Wiesbaden with Beach Aerospace and the maintenance of the C-12 program for the U.S. military. The C-12 is the Beach 200 turboprop. So I stayed with them for 5 months, and then looking through a copy of Flight International magazine, found out that Federal Express was looking for a regional maintenance manager in Belgium. I applied and was hired by them.
Oh, wonderful.
So I worked from about 1987 till 1993 with FedEx as a regional maintenance manager in Europe.
And
in Brussels. Well, they had another large reorganization. They closed down the flight operations into Brussels, and there was no job for me, so I came over and I took over as a maintenance manager for the flight operations in Frankfurt. And then after FedEx decided to downsize Frankfurt, we went from 25 mechanics down to 5, and then they said, we don't need a manager anymore, so I was unemployed again. But by that time, the FAA had approached me to become a DAR, Designated Airworthiness Representative. So seeing the handwriting on the wall and knowing which way the company was going with me in it, I thought that was probably a smart thing to do.
Yeah,
and so 1993, in September, I was laid off by FedEx. And I hung my shingle out as a DAR and a consultant, and spent about 3 months waiting for things to happen. Eventually, things started up.
Right.
I actually started my own business working as a consultant in the certification of repair stations. A number of repair stations that had applied for FAA approval in Europe needed to write their procedures manual, and so it needed help writing their procedures manual. So. They approached me, could you come down and proofread this and do with it? And I worked between them and the FAA to get the repair stations up to speed and everything. And I did about three or four repair stations certifications, and then was doing some work with small aircraft certification. And in the certification world, it's mostly by word of mouth. So then my business started picking up. I eventually won a contract with Lufthansa in Hamburg for certification of 14 Airbuses
Oh, wow.
that were bought by FedEx from Lufthansa,
Right.
and we're going through the first A310 freighter conversions. So I got involved with that. FedEx, when I applied for it, there were approximately 3 people that had bid on it. FedEx encouraged Lufthansa to take me because of my previous experience with FedEx and understanding their paperwork system, their maintenance program, and so on. And then the people that were running this cargo conversion program from the FedEx side knew me at FedEx when I was there, and they said, hey, we can work with this guy. So Lufthansa hired me for the project.
Oh, what a turn of events. You certainly have had no lack of work. Jeez.
No, not really, no.
Do you recall who headed up the EC? It's probably been different people over the 8 years. Like, was there a chancellor or a provost or something like that ran the extended campus from?
Yeah, they did. They only came over like once a year or something, maybe twice a year at the most. And when I was in the field, like in Rota, I never saw them much. One guy, he was a retired admiral, came down to Rota, Spain one time, but I don't remember his name.
Okay.
And Jack Hunt was even over there several times, but I was out of the area when he was visiting.
Was there a faculty senate of any kind back then?
No.
Interesting.
One of the aggravating things we did is, I will admit that Riddle was very minimalist in their support for adjunct faculty. We didn't have a lot of resources. You got a textbook and they said, oh, you figure it out, And I think they were making a lot of money off the international campus at the time because they built a new chapel here, and they were saying, "Gee, we're having to scrape and do very creative and imaginative things to make the classes work, and they're taking all the money and building chapels." So there was a little bit of animosity from the adjunct faculty and the permanent faculty over in Europe at the time, saying this. It was just a money machine that was supporting the campus back here.
I think that you'd find that that's still a common thought, perhaps.
Yeah. One of the things as the AMT coordinator that I did is that I convinced the university to buy several tape reproducers, and we got master tapes on 3/4-inch cassettes.
Right.
And we reproduced our own training films in Europe, and that was part of my job. My office had about 200 tapes in there, so they were maintenance tapes, history of aviation, government and aviation, just about any subject you could think of. So that was one thing that we did that was a big help.
The studio that we're filming in now, for our future audience, they film course work in here. That's one of the things that Distance Ed does. So, okay, well, if there wasn't a faculty senate, is there a way you can describe the relationship you would have had with the other EC, like even the other faculty in the German area? Like, how would you know who the other EC faculty were? Did you
People pretty much kept to their own. As from my perspective, the faculty pretty much kept to their own site. Most of them were adjutant faculty. They had a lot of military people coming in to teach. For example, we had some senior Air Force sergeants and so on that had A&P licenses, and they would teach AMT. In England, because you had a good source of educated people there, we hired civilians to come in and teach for us. I hired a woman named Mary Aylett, who I'm still good friends with her and her husband, to teach math courses for us.
Right.
And she was quite surprised when I showed up myself to take the math course.
That's great.
And what they did is they just dealt with the center and came and went as they needed. And if they wanted something, we tried to get it for them. They would have once a year in Germany. They did have a couple of times. I think it was once or twice a year they tried to organize it, an overall sort of faculty meeting to kind of get an idea of what people's ideas were, what their complaints were, their concerns, and that sort of thing. But it was no big formal issue. If you could drive to it, fine. The Riddle wasn't going to buy you an airplane ticket to come to it. And we had one time, I think twice, when I was there in Wiesbaden between '83 to '86. We actually had I organized an AMT seminar for instructors teaching AMT courses. What did they have? What could they use? What was good? What was bad? It was an informal thing, usually done on a Saturday afternoon. It wasn't anything very structured or just kind of show up and tell us what you're thinking kind of thing.
you mind me asking what the pay was like? Were people happy with the pay? And the reason I ask that is that one of the sort of cultural rumors around here is that one way Embry-Riddle survived in its early days was by having so many ex-military that Jack Hunt used to feel that, well, you'd have a pension, so it was easier to lower the pay. Were you...
I believe that. The pay was terrible.
Okay.
What they would do is, if I can recall now, you were paid so much a student, and the minimum class was, I think, like 12 students. Now, what they would do is they would, and this was something they used to lowball you on, say you only got 6 or 8 students. They say,
Right.
well, we can't pay you the full amount because there's only 6 or 8 students. So you'd say, okay, and people taught because they wanted to teach. They wanted
Right.
the experience, they
Right.
wanted to put it on their resume.
Right.
But then on the other hand, if the minimum class number was 12 and you had 16 or 20 students, they would not pay you more than that. You know, hey, last time I took a short course, why don't you give me a little extra on this one because there's
Right.
more students now. Oh, no, we can't do that. They could do it, but they just wouldn't.
They wouldn't do it.
They wouldn't do it. One of the things that happened to me that I was pretty disgusted with is when I was transferred from Spain back to Germany. I was an employee, and at that time in the employee handbook there was a policy for the university paying all the moving expenses if
Right.
they were moved at their request.
Right.
And when I inquired about it, John McCurdy told me, he says, well, you lost your job on Friday and rehired on the following Tuesday when you showed up in Germany. And I never received a cent other than
Jeez.
mileage for driving. All my, I had no real household goods, no furniture to speak of, but I had books, I had
Yeah, sure.
personal items I had collected. I had a collection of antique airplane propellers that I had picked up. And basically the only way I got that transferred from Spain up to Germany in 1983 was from the goodness of friends who managed to sneak them onto Mac flights and call me up and say, hey, a guy named Joe is going to be at Rhine-Main on the C-130 and he's got your propeller.
He's got the propeller.
You know, and I just thought that was a pretty poor
Yeah.
way to do business. And
No kidding. Yeah.
yeah, and so it just left a bad taste in my mouth for being an amateur-run organization.
Did you talk to other faculty that had similar...
Nobody else had that situation. The only ones that came over here were the deans that were sent over from the United States.
Yeah.
The regional directors were virtually 100% retired military, so that decided to live in Germany, so they were there already, you know, with their families, so on like that. There were a couple of civilians. There was one woman who ran England named Julia Futch, but she had been, I think, the director of the personnel department over here in Daytona Beach, but she was engaged to a doctor who was doing medical research in England, and she, I don't know if they paid her way over there or not, but she took over as the regional director for the United Kingdom when I was in Bentwaters Woodbridge from 79 to 80. Now, how she came over, I don't know. But
Okay.
yeah, they wouldn't move your household goods even though it was in the
handbook.
in the handbook.
Oh, jeez.
They gave you excuses for it.
Oh, find any way around it, right? Were you, how well aware were you of other happenings at the university while you were an employee then? Did you know sort of the politics of what was going on in Daytona, or you started it in 78? It was just about then that we started our Prescott campus. Did you know?
They didn't, you know, you'd hear in a conversation, hey, we're going to open another campus in Prescott. And I said, oh, and somebody would comment, oh, well, that's where all the European money's going to. There was a lot of hard feeling about the money issue there, particularly. And you know, we would get copies of the Riddle newspaper and stuff like that. And so,
But
you know,
did you feel part of, you know, Embry-Riddle as a whole, or did you feel much more that it was, you know, your sense of belonging was just amongst
your sense of belonging was you knew that there was a university way out there someplace, but you were just trying to survive in your own little planet somewhere else, wherever it was you happened to be, in Germany or England or Spain or Italy or something like that.
So contact with the mothership was rare.
Rare. We never had any contact directly. We weren't allowed and had no contact with the home campus. Everything we did went through Wiesbaden.
Okay.
Now things worked. If you wanted some academic materials, we had a bookstore then. They had a large library where they would ship books into Germany, store them there, and as centers needed classes, they would order books and they would get their book orders in and they would be shipped out. So I mean, that worked. There was a logistics system that supplied the textbooks for the students. Of course, you got all the Riddle administrative forms, the veteran forms and things like that you needed for government, for the GIs to take classes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there was a communication there. We could call through the military telephone system on any base in Europe to the Air Force Base at Lindsay Air Station now. And the old Embry-Riddle office is now part of the Bundeskriminalamt in Germany, which is their equivalent of the FBI.
Oh, interesting.
It's fence around it, you can't get near it.
No,
But you can drive past it, and you can say, there's the old B-20.
What, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask a little bit about the different students you've had over the years. In the 8 years, are there people that have stood out? How did they change over that time period? Were they mostly military? Can you just chat a little
Well,
bit about that?
since I was dealing with the military program, virtually 100% of the students I came in touch with were military.
Right.
Occasionally, you would get a civilian from outside the base that would know about Embry-Riddle, and somehow they'd call you up and say, "Oh, you're with Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University.
Right.
Do you have any information? I would like to go there. Or my son, one of my children, would like to go there." Riddle was a private institution, an expensive one.
Right.
So at that time, for anybody to send their children to Embry-Riddle from Europe, and they did. There were Europeans here at the time. We knew that. They would have to deal with the university separately for the admissions over here. But I had, on several times, I was requested, so I'd get them a catalog or something just for interest. Probably the most notable person that came over, and he was affiliated with the European campus because he did go through them, but came over here and studied, was Camille Dornier of the Dornier aircraft manufacturing family in Germany.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, did you notice a change in the quality of students, how hard they would work or anything like that over the years?
Across the board, most students worked pretty hard. The problem I had with AMT at the time, the courses they would run from 4 hours a night twice a week, 6 till 10. All the AMT courses were 4 credit hours, so we had to do 4 hours a night. And these poor men and women would come in after starting work at 6 o'clock in the morning, and when you got them 12 hours later. One of the things I developed in part of my own personal teaching technique were methods to keep people awake. Because they would literally, the whole cast would sit there and not out like this, one after the other. They would just kind of close like switches. And when I was at Ramstein, for some reason, there was a wooden pole about 8 feet long and about 4 inches in diameter. And I used to walk around with, like King Neptune, slamming this thing on the floor, and telling of course, my war chest of war stories wasn't very deep at the time, just what I had done in the Navy and a little bit, working on civilian airplanes in the weekends. But I'd been a Navy aircraft electrician on old aircraft for 8 years, so I had a lot of practical experience from that standpoint.
Right.
And so I'd relate a course we were studying to some of my own personal experience and walk around and crack funny stories and so on like this, and pound the pole on the floor and give them a break once an hour to go have coffee and a cigarette, and just try and keep them awake the best you could. But the dedication was always there. These people, they wanted to get somewhere in the world. You had all realms. You had senior NCOs that were going for E8, E9. They wanted to get a degree so they could get the promotion from, say, E7 and above. You had junior NCOs and younger enlisted people that some of them wanted a career in the Air Force. Some of them wanted to, start their university studies early so they could get out and continue a life and so on.
Do you know many of them still? Do you stay
I have
no
I don't. But ironically, about 6 months ago, I was doing a certification of a Learjet for a company in Dusseldorf, and the owner of the airplane, the company that was buying it, said to me, "Do you know so and so?" And I said, "No, the name doesn't sound familiar." Well, he said he had you as a maintenance instructor for Embry-Riddle up in Bentwaters Woodbridge in about 1979 and 80. And he said, "Oh, he was a good instructor." So
yeah, I was going to say to remember that. That's great.
Yeah, but I've never come across a single student again.
Not interesting.
No, very few of the people ever completed the AMT program and went ahead and got their AMP license. I eventually became a designated mechanic examiner for Embry-Riddle, appointed by the FAA. I gave us a number of exams down in Rota, Spain, but when I came to Germany in '83, we had the maintenance lab in Capone, so the FAA let me continue as a DME there and use the maintenance lab in Capone. And I probably certified, in a 3-year period, over 100 people.
Wow.
I had a program where the students could come in on a Friday. They would come to the Riddle office on B-20, building B-20 at Wiesbaden Air Base. And on Friday afternoon, starting about 4 or 5 o'clock, we went through an oral exam. The FAA has the oral and practical, so we do the oral and so what I would call soft portions of the practical exam. So you would have a wiring diagram, and they would have to demonstrate how to read an electrical schematic, work, weight, and balance problems, and those kind of things. And then the next day we would go down to Capone, and I would have them actually work on the airplane, identify maintenance problems, and complete the practical exam. And then issue the A&P license, yeah.
That's great. You've sort of answered my next question, which is, you know, in these days, the administration often wants the faculty to be conducting research, and you know, if you're in the social sciences and humanities, which is my background, they want publications and whatnot. And if you're
publish or perish type of situation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in your case, you've done a lot of consulting work since.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, you've sort of alluded to it a bit, maybe there's a few more stories you can tell about how you were maybe able to bring your consulting work or any research, if that's even the right word, from your private business life to the classroom. And you sort of hinted at that a bit.
Well, at the time I was employed by Embry-Riddle, the only work I was doing outside of that at the time was as an A&P mechanic. I had a good deal with the Rota Navy Flying Club. I arrived in Rota in 1980. I wanted to get a pilot's license, and I found out they had no mechanic. They had about 4 very beat-up airplanes and no mechanic. What they had was they had a man there whose wife was in the Navy. He was a civilian. He had been an engineman in the Coast Guard. He was also a flight instructor. So he knew about airplanes. He knew technical things, but he didn't have the license. So that we made a deal that I would oversee his work. And I was given on my books $5 an hour for every hour that he worked. But that was only to be used, not paid in cash, but to be used to offset my flying license.
Right, okay.
So he would work an 8-hour day, 6-hour day like that, and I'd make $45 a day on my credit towards flying. Right. So that worked out, and things like that. And so I worked there. Private individuals sometimes contacted me to help with it. I did some work for Grumman AdCat business. They were exporting airplanes over to Europe and down to Africa, and they were assembling them in Portugal and need them signed off, and they needed annual inspections. So they contacted me to go over there, and I would drive over to Évora in Portugal to do the inspections on these crop dusters,
right, okay.
And a few things like that. So there was some outside work I could bring in. And working on the small airplanes, I hadn't had any formal training or experience on them in the Navy, but they're easy enough to figure out, and so I just kind of bumbled through it and would take that experience into the classroom with me.
Do you change subjects completely here now and just reminisce with me for a moment? Are there any sort of major crises that you sort of had to solve? Any big, fish stories you can tell us about? Just any good stories you can recall about trying to, get a class done on time, or, a building falling down on your head, or, are there any things that you recall?
Nothing really drastic like that. One time I hired a registrar who was desperate for a job, and she didn't like me, and she wanted my job. And I was going on a business trip, and I was standing at 6 o'clock in the morning to get on a C-141 in Rota, and the ESO comes over. He says, "Steve, you can't go. You got to come back. We got a real problem." I said, "What happened?" He said, "This woman called Embry-Riddle, she called me, and called a bunch of other people, and she's really trying to totally destroy you."
Oh my God! So
I went in there, and this woman was just raving and telling all the how bad I was and everything else. So they, within a few days, I got a phone call from Bob Hagelberger, who just started as the assistant dean, and they said, "Just stay away from the office for a day or so until we get this sorted out." And he came down, spoke to her for about an hour, and then I never saw her again. She was gone.
My goodness.
And he said, he just spoke to me, and he says, she was upset. So just go back to work and do what you were doing, sort of thing. Yeah. There were no real major crises like that. Now, you would get problems with students deploying, but you just kind of found ways to get around that type of thing.
Sure. That's a good point.
The only thing I was concerned about at the time in 1979 is when the Iran crisis started with the hostages.
Good point.
And I was in the UK at the time. I had just left the Navy the year before. I had been in there 9 years. I was an E5, a second-class petty officer, aviation electrician's mate. And there was rumors and, well, rumors, talk that if there was a large escalation, they would be calling up people on inactive reserve and going after recent departees from the military. And I thought, oh no, I hope I don't have to go back, because I really didn't want to at that point. And so I just kind of kept a close eye on that. But otherwise, there was nothing really major that I can think of off the top of my head that...
Okay. Nothing you want to say on film anymore.
Nothing I want to say on film. There's,
Right.
yeah, there's a few. Other than, you know, probably the worst thing that happened to me, when I got called back from Spain to Germany by McCurdy, they had no fixed job for me, so they had me moving around different places. My household goods were spread all over, somewhere between Spain and Germany. And it got so bad I actually developed stress-related illnesses and had to undergo medical treatment for it.
Jeez.
You know, and I didn't have any money in the bank. It was just, you know, bad news all around. I had to stick it out and get through it, but eventually it worked out.
Yeah. Well, why don't we wrap up by, do you have any thoughts on where you see Embry-Riddle going in the future, or the EC? I mean, it's been years since you've been an employee here, but I mean, being in the industry, do you obviously still know about us and see a role for...
Yeah, I think actually while I was here on this trip, I met Dennis Grottian and a few of the other people here that are involved with the extended campus, and I see that you know, Riddle is looking to build programs in other regions of the world, and I think that's a good idea. One thing is that everybody agreed on is since 9/11. It's not easy for student visas to come in anymore, particularly
Right.
for Middle East and third world countries. They're afraid of these people.
Right.
So why not bring it to them? And I think the other thing that would be in Riddle's favor, and they're going to have to spend money, they're going to have to do research, they're going to have to look at it, but I think the chances there's much more harmonization. You've got the FAA and the JAA now becoming more closely aligned, with the JAA being in Europe, which is the second biggest aircraft manufacturing region in the world, the U.S. being the first one, and all facts of aviation, from general aviation, sport aviation, all the way up through air transport, that the manufacturing, the operations, the maintaining regulations are all being unified. And I think Riddle is doing the right thing by going to these countries and working with them and try and get programs set up that would allow people to get you know, higher education degrees and so on. I think this is good timing to do it.
Right.
I would suggest too, another thing that Riddle hasn't done in Europe, and I always thought was a lucrative market, and when I was at Riddle I suggested it, and it was just, I was responded with a blank stare,
Right.
is that you have professional aviation seminars sponsored by various institutions like the Cranfield Institute of Aeronautics, various leasing organizations, you know, the Society of Aircraft Transport Traders and so on, would arrange seminars on aircraft financing, aircraft leasing, what it is now, where's it going, what are we
Right.
looking at, and they would bring in keynote speakers from all over the industry, and it's something Riddle could get involved with, either partially
Sure.
or wholly, as a sponsor of one of these organizations.
Sure.
And I certainly think that would, within the aviation world, enhance their visibility.
Interesting. I hope that they will watch this tape and maybe take you up on some of these offers.
I wish they'd reimburse me for the move from Spain to Germany, because that's still
Well,
up my
that's
nose.
on record now. So. Unless there's anything else you want to add, thank you so much.
Okay,
been a
thank you for
pleasure.
inviting me here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
God, thanks so much. That's great.
Good.
That was fantastic. Not too painful, I hope, for you.
On your notebook paper, let me give you the name of this individual here.
Sure.
Bill Dickinson.
Okay.
Area code 619
619
557
557
5281.